First, to build a little bit of context, we need to answer the question, what was the Bronze Age collapse? Explained as fast as possible, otherwise it would no longer be just a little bit of context. At the beginning of the 12th century BC, the most populous, prosperous, and technologically advanced empires on planet Earth were all right next to each other, with the notable exception of the Shang dynasty in what is now China. These states formed a robust interconnected system of economic, political, and cultural exchange that endured for many centuries. And then, in the span of a few decades, diplomacy, trade, and prosperity gave way to famine, war, and chaos. The resulting devastation was so severe that even the ability to read and write was lost for hundreds of years in many regions throughout the greater Near East. In what is now Greece, written records disappeared for almost 500 years. This loss of civilization was so extraordinary that this collapse has often been called an apocalypse. This video is about those that survived. Context over. But first, before we answer the question who survived, let's briefly talk about who did not survive. Generally speaking, if one were a general, king, queen, priest, noble, or any of the long-established ruling class, chances of survival were slim. These fine folks were often the first to go. They were not only the primary targets of foreign invaders, but also often fell victim to their own people's wrath. When these political and religious leaders, who controlled the lion's share of the land's wealth, failed to deliver on their promises of safety, prosperity, and a belly full of food, they were naturally blamed for the bad times. However, war, famine, and sickness were not caused by poor leadership alone, and the bad times became worse. Conflict became constant, and life expectancy was certainly not great for military men. Also was a bad time to try to stay alive for most non-military men as well. Farmers, who would have been the majority of the population pretty much everywhere, mostly died off, as irrigation systems were destroyed and marauders roamed the countryside. The city folk didn't do any better, and probably did a worse job at surviving on average. Scribes in particular seem to have failed at living, given the lack of written records from the ensuing Dark Age that followed the Bronze Age collapse. In addition to scribes, the butcher, the baker, and the chariot maker, and pretty much everyone who lived in towns and cities didn't make it, with few exceptions. Without a massive base of rural farmers, well-maintained irrigation, and imported goods that were necessary to support a city, demoralized city dwellers became the victims of invaders, marauders, or themselves. While life in the big city vanished, or greatly diminished, there were some exceptions, the most notable of which was Egypt. The year is 1077, roughly 100 years after the Bronze Age collapse. The once mighty Egyptian empire has shrank into a shriveled husk of its former glory, like its pharaoh, Ramses XI, who is a tired and dying old man. He is the last of many pharaohs to be named Ramses. He is also the last native Egyptian pharaoh to rule over a united Egypt. Like his immediate predecessors, his long reign was a sad one. Long gone were the days of god kings, beloved by the people, throwing lavish parties to celebrate imperial victories in far-off lands. The Egyptian economy crashed, prices of basic goods skyrocketed, and taxes were high to maintain the army. Consequently, the malcontented urban population frequently revolted. In those times, pharaohs were more likely to wage war against their own people than a foreign adversary, and rebellions were brutally put down. Egypt managed to defeat foreign invasions and dominate its own dwindling population, while most contemporary empires and kingdoms collapsed. Part of Egypt's strategy was to hire many of the invaders as mercenaries, like the Sea Peoples, and, most notably, many Libyans were hired. The army was paid well, while Egypt's borders slowly shrank. All was sacrificed to feed the Egyptian war machine, including the pharaoh's power. In the Nile Delta, Tanis rose as a rival power center to the old capital of Memphis. There, the strongman Mendes ruled. Little is known of his origins and path to power, but it was likely similar to Herihor, the ruler of Thebes. Herihor rose through the ranks of the Egyptian army, eventually becoming not only the Egyptian supreme military commander and Grand Vizier of the South, but the Viceroy of Kush, and finally, the High Priest of Ammon at Thebes. Herihor took on some pharaonic titles and iconography while still acknowledging Ramses XI's authority, predominantly in name only. The power of Egypt's military, secular, and religious institutions were combined and wielded by one autocrat, monopolizing the violence and corruption that have always been a part of power. Herihor not only held absolute control over his citizens' life by the sword, but also their afterlife. Herihor was indicative of the violent, brutal, and efficient men that came to dominate Egypt for centuries to come. Following Ramses XI's death, Egypt's split in two was solidified. The two new rival dynasties that formed engaged in a long-standing, mostly Cold War with each other. Ramses XI was never buried in his tomb. Instead, it became a workshop for stripping ancient mummies of their valuables in a semi-respectful manner. Even the gold on the coffins was scraped off. The methodical manner this appears to have been carried out means these mummies were probably looted by state actors. Massive spending on the army and an overtaxed, demoralized populace made the fabulous wealth buried in the ground a tempting target for state-sponsored looting. The new dynasties that had access to temple treasure maps may have not viewed their predecessors' tombs as sacred as before. These pharaohs no longer boasted of foreign victories or massive building projects, but occasionally boasted of maintenance on crumbling monuments, or, if they were less honest, wrote their names over old masterworks, pretending they had built them. As an isolated, impoverished Egypt lingered on, those not so fortunate as to live in a post-apocalyptic dystopian dictatorship run by an authoritarian megalomaniac lived a very different life. The Egyptians credited the piratical band of Mediterranean maritime marauders known as the Sea Peoples with the destruction of the international system of states they were a part of. This view was based off of their own personal experience of being invaded by the Sea Peoples multiple times, while the eastern Mediterranean they were familiar with was ravaged and plundered. However, more than any nautical threat, much more insidious, formidable, and familiar forces played a larger role in bringing the great empires of bronze to their ruin. The grand Hittite capital city of Hattusa was sacked by a coalition of former subjects and new enemies. Foremost among them were the Kaskas, a fierce tribe of mountain warriors, who were a long time off and on again Hittite vassal, and now they were out for vengeance. Like Hattusa, Babylon, the intellectual and cultural center of Mesopotamia, was sacked, pillaged, and plundered, and much of its population massacred by the Assyrian king Tukulti-Ninurta. As the city slowly recovered, it was sacked again by the Elamites, plunging southern Mesopotamia into a centuries-long dark age. The Elamites were by far the most organized, powerful, and populous of all the major mountain peoples of the Late Bronze Age. In addition to the Elamites, there were many more petty kingdoms, cities, and towns of the Anatolian, Southern Caucasus, and Zagros mountain ranges that had long-standing antagonistic relationships with the kingdoms and empires of the Flatlands. When the much more populous Flatlanders were united and strong, they pushed their weight around. They marched their armies throughout the mountains and extorted tribute from the overwhelmed mountain people in exchange for not burning down their crops, towns, and cities. When the tables were turned, in times of civil war, famine, or any other time of weakness, the tough and patient mountain people flooded into the flatlands, collecting tribute and sacking cities. This usually ended when enough organized resistance was mounted, or, as was sometimes the case, the mountain peoples settled among the flatlanders as a new ruling class, eventually assimilating into their culture, like had been the case with the earlier Hurrians, Gutians, and Kassites. In contrast to their success, in the early decades of the Bronze Age collapse, the warlike Assyrians defeated just about every mountain people that attempted to establish themselves in Mesopotamia. Assyria appeared to be on the verge of holding the collapsing age together by their own force of will and brutality until they met their match. A people more stubbornly resilient than the mountain peoples, and more terrifying than the sea peoples. Long before the Bronze Age collapsed, during its most stable and prosperous epoch, there were those that just didn't fit into society. Some were criminal fugitives, bandits, or those who just wanted freedom. On the southern periphery of the Fertile Crescent, a multitude of small familial clans eked out an existence as pastoral nomads. A little bit of water, or patch of grass, could mean the difference between life and death. Consequently, these people were fiercely competitive, highly mobile, and nearly indestructible. In contrast to the mountain peoples, who hoarded away a wealth of metals and other highly prized resources in their remote citadels, the people of the wasteland had very little wealth, which the Bronze Age empires could extort from them, so they were usually left alone. The wastelanders periodically visited the region's cities and traded sheepskins and other assorted loot with the settled peoples. But their most notable role in pre-collapse Bronze Age society was as mercenaries. These tough tribal people, with an extensive knowledge of the region's terrain, would be frequently hired to guide and guard caravans, or attack, raid, or harass one city on behalf of another. By the later 12th century BC, their time had come. The age of epic battles fought between collapsing empires was drawing to a close. This gave way to a short period of Assyrian dominance over much of the Near East, but despite their success, the empire was exhausted, overextended, and the land they ruled over was devastated. Then, the floodgates opened, and the wastelanders poured in. Chaldeans, Sutians, and Arameans were the most numerous of the tribal peoples to migrate into Mesopotamia. The countryside was devastated, but in comparison to the wasteland, where clans could spend generations fighting over access to a well, the depopulated rubble of the old world would have appeared as if the gates of heaven had opened up. Now they had much better things to squabble over, like gold, wine, slaves, and prestige. Where mass-irrigated fields of grains had once stood, there was more than enough wild grasses growing for sheep to have a hearty meal or two. Because of this, pastoral nomads thrived after the collapse, and their way of life became the dominant lifestyle almost everywhere in the Near East. And as the sheep population grew, so did the population of those who ate them, especially the Arameans. Because of their mobile nature, the Assyrians found it nearly impossible to stamp them out with conventional military means. Assyrian kings frequently boasted of wiping the Arameans off the face of the earth. Then, a few years later, they would boast of defeating them again and again, but this time for good. The Assyrians were not keen on keeping records of their own defeats, but 3 signs point to the likelihood they frequently lost during this period. 1. The large number of campaigns they waged against the Arameans. 2. They made and kept peace with survivors from their old enemy Babylon, who was also being overrun by nomadic pastoralists. 3. They ultimately abandoned their empire and retreated into their heartland, which itself was under Aramean assault. Some of their cities were sacked, and even an aqueduct to their capital city was destroyed, and it lay unrepaired for decades. The Arameans were everywhere. Some daring warlords captured remote Assyrian mountain citadels and outposts. These were used as the base of operations for further marauding. Numerous small bands of Arameans stalked the countryside, enslaving rural farmers. Consequently, many refugees flooded into Assyria's cities. This caused food shortages, sickness, popular unrest, and ultimately civil war. While many still maintained their nomadic way of life, over time, many of the illiterate Aramean herdsmen became kings. Many of these kings were merely the rulers of fortified towns and villages built on the ruins of what were once cities. There were some legitimately powerful Aramean kings and chieftains who could marshal thousands of men into battle. However, the independent and competitive nature of the Arameans meant that they never united into a larger empire, and were frequently at war with themselves, as they were with almost everyone else. In the west, there was a chunk of the Hittite Empire that never fell. It transitioned into a collection of loosely allied city-states called the neo-hittites. Here the Aramean onslaught appears to have been slightly more gentle. In this case, all we know is that around 1000 BC, the rulers of many of the city-states there came to have Aramean names, and the culture gradually became more Aramean. One possible scenario is that the Hittite cities in this region became so sick of being constantly extorted by a never-ending series of Aramean warlords, chiefs, and petty kings, that one day they said, "Hey, you want to come here and be a real king and defend us from the rest of your buddies?" That ended up working, and a bunch of other cities followed the same strategy. The long-standing, most powerful, and stable Aramean kingdom was Aram Damascus. From there, the Arameans launched many campaigns against the Hebrew tribes to their south. Some scholars believe the Hebrews were the Habiru mentioned in earlier Egyptian records, while others think the term Habiru was a generic term for some of the wastelanders in the region, similar to how Alamu appears to have been a generic term for wastelanders to the northeast. So it could be said the Arameans were Alamu, but not all Alamu were Arameans. The Hebrews also had nomadic pastoralist roots, and followed a somewhat similar trajectory as the Arameans did, gradually becoming city dwellers and founding formidable states. Despite the chaotic age, many of the battered city-states in the Levant enjoyed a golden age of sort, after things started to settle down a little bit after 1000 BC. The region was no longer at the crossroads of powerful empires, which allowed the kingdoms and city-states there to thrive and fight amongst themselves for a little while. To the south, more than 200 years after the Bronze Age collapse, the semi-nomadic Libyans that had poured into the Nile Delta and served in the Egyptian army slowly took over the Egyptian military, government, and finally the throne. The Libyan pharaoh Shoshenq united the land, and for the first time, a foreign dynasty ruled all of Egypt. After the Bronze Age collapse, it was undoubtedly the warlike semi-nomadic herdsmen that proved themselves the best survivalists. This ability to survive was in large part due to their mobility. They could move away from greater threats and take advantage of weaker targets. Their society was efficient, low maintenance, and based around small united family units. Before I get back to our regular programming, a brief message from this video sponsors. This video has been sponsored by Bronze. Tired of your copper bending or your iron rusting? I recommend you buy bronze, and a lot of it. Why buy Bitcoin when you can buy a pound of bronze for a very affordable $2.02 a pound? Now that is what I call a bargain. This video is also sponsored by my fantastic patrons over on Patreon, who have helped out this channel through the tough times. One group of people I believe would have survived at a greater rate than most other civilians would have been merchants. They have the ability and know how to travel long distances, preferably away from danger. They were master negotiators and could possibly barter to save their own life. Merchants would have known many languages and social customs to get around foreign areas. One piece of anecdotal evidence is that during the Bronze Age collapse, the Assyrian king Ashur-bel-kala built the world's first recorded zoo. This is while his empire was being torn apart by civil war and Aramean tribal incursion. So even though good old Ashur-bel-kala may have failed in setting his priorities straight, his merchants did succeed in acquiring exotic animals from far-off lands for their king's zoo, which included an ape and a crocodile. Their ability to travel through hostile terrain and return with such unwieldy cargo is a testament to the merchants' resourcefulness, which may indicate they were good at surviving. The Greek island of Euboea is the only example I can think of where the pre-existing farmers survived and thrived after the collapse. Once a Mycenaean backwater, the island became a fortress where small family farms grew and banded together in a collective defense. Centuries later, the Euboeans were the first Greeks to emerge from their dark ages, establish colonies in far-off lands, and rediscover writing. What happened after this post-apocalyptic age? The short answer is Assyria. If you enjoyed this video, you will probably enjoy my many other videos on the Bronze Age and the ancient Near East. This has been Epimetheus, and thank you so much for watching to the end of the video.